I'm Alastair Campbell. This is James Graham, and James Graham is going to be in conversation with Alastair Campbell. It says so there. And I'm going to start. Everybody knows who James is, I hope. Probably. Everybody knows who I am, I hope. Don't care. I want to start actually with. Guess what I'm going to start with?
Brexit.
Correct. I want. Do you think that seeing that what's happening with Dominic Cummings at the moment, where he's kind of in Downing Street advising a new Prime Minister at this historic time, do you get the feeling that maybe being portrayed by Benedict Cumberbatch has gone to his head?
Or gone to Boris Johnson's head? No, I don't know. It's hi everyone, thank you for coming. I just found that whole thing. I didn't even think writing that film was remotely controversial. I have to say, the amount of scrutiny and attention it generated surprised and shocked me, and I had to learn very quickly how much to engage with that conversation.
But hold on, how can you say that it shocked you? That I mean, Brexit is like the defining issue of our time, and a total disaster, by the way.
But yes, and so I knew the issue itself would be very emotive, and the dramatisation of that referendum, of course, would stir lots of polarising feelings. I mean, its very existence, the people questioning whether or not it had a right to exist, or if it was responsible, or if it was helpful, for the reasons being the story is continuing onwards, and I do get and understand that. So to your point about Dominic Cummings now being at the heart of Downing Street, obviously I never imagined for a second when I was writing it he was someone who was completely on the fringes of mainstream political discourse. So I try to, as I normally try to do in plays and TV, pick slightly weird and unfamiliar ways into what feels familiar. And he felt like a very surprising choice who nobody would have heard of to put on screen. So I'm as shocked as anybody that he's now at the heart of our national life.
But do you not think that when we live in a world where like Donald Trump is now the president, and he was a reality TV star, and media and politics have kind of fused in the way that they have, do you not think it's possible the fact that he became such a much bigger figure much more through your film than he did through the campaign, that actually that then plays into the mind of somebody like Boris Johnson, who's, you know, a bit of a showbiz character?
I don't think so. You may disagree, but I don't imagine for a second that Boris Johnson watched a Channel 4 drama and thought, I'm going to base my policy around that.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that maybe you helped create a bigger sense of who somebody was, and that is now shaping the way that he is conducting himself in what is an incredibly important position.
No, I still don't. I think
you're not taking any responsibility.
Otherwise I won't be able to sleep at night. So I have to absolutely.
Well, on that, how you saw Cummings, right?
Yes.
So I've been portrayed in quite a few films, and I've always had a blanket thing: don't see them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, basically, because I just think you risk authorising, as it were. So let them get on with it. But do you not think that seeing the people that you saw, does that in any way soften how you might think they should be portrayed?
There's a danger, and I have a weakness in that if people are nice to me, I like them. And it's just
I've got the opposite.
But I sort of don't hate it. I from the very beginning, when I started writing political plays and dramas, I don't know how conscious of it I was, but it was normally, especially in theatre, it was very unusual when I did this play called This House at the National Theatre, which tried to portray politicians as human beings that were frail and strong and weak, and sympathetic across the political spectrum as well. So having Tories who weren't villains in a British stage play.
And who had really good relations with Labour people as well. That was what.
And show how the day-to-day workings of people and how they have to get on and work together and compromise and find consensus. I find that quite moving, and I always wanted to humanise and try and generate what I think is one of the things we're struggling with most in drama, politics, and the rest of our life is empathy. And drama has a unique power to create empathy towards people or characters who you might disagree with. So I feel like I have to meet them because I have to understand them. And also, I guess one of my defensive pushbacks a bit against some politicians or journalists who questioned whether or not it was right or proper to do a Brexit story at this time was that, for whatever reason, Dominic Cummings has rejected a lot of scrutiny. He famously hasn't gone into Parliament to testify for a committee and was found in contempt of Parliament from doing that. Ever since after the campaign ended, he has refused to do journalistic interviews. But for whatever reason, he was happy to speak to a playwright and a screenwriter. And I don't think there was anything to do with me or my manner. But I felt the responsibility of that, to go into his home and for him to tell me things that he hadn't told anybody else. And that, I guess, is why I fight for and believe that drama has a seat at this table, because there's sometimes these people, like the whips in this house. The whips never speak to anybody, they never publish memoirs, never publish diaries, but they were happy to speak to a dramatist and put those secrets on stage in a way they wouldn't possibly do in a documentary or on a news interview.
But then they trust you to dramatise. You're not telling the whole truth, you're telling a truth that you're assessing.
Yeah, there are all these filters. There's your filter, then there's the actor, then there's the director, then there's the editor, and then there's the audience. And so it's not as exposing for them, I think. And also, audiences are smart. I sort of always, I understand why we need that card at the beginning that goes, this is made up, this isn't real, these are actors. Benedict Cumberbatch didn't actually run Vote Leave, and you have to say that. But audiences know that you're going, they know what art is. And that's why when they watch The Crown, the first thing we know everyone does is go on Wikipedia and go, did Princess Margaret really sleep with that person? So I do think we can be a bit more nuanced in our approach to dramatising.
But do you not think that when it's right here, right now, when the characters are still there and still on, as it were, on the political stage, that becomes a lot harder than when it's historical?
It's harder, but it's more important. We are living through a national trauma at the moment, and historically, drama has always been at the front of that. In fact, I would argue, 2,000 years ago, it was theatre that set the conditions to allow democracy to exist. It was theatre festivals that, for the first time, drew in different disparate tribes into one place, and of an evening they would put the day's events on stage, they would satirise their leaders, the leaders would have to sit there and watch it. So I understand I certainly understand the responsibility of injecting something provocative and upsetting at this dangerous time, but that is the function of drama.
You think maybe we should shut down Parliament and let the Royal Television Society delegates take on the governance of the country?
Prorogue, and then I would prorogue the festival and just take it myself. No, I think I do think. Yes, to your point, that's why I was surprised, I suppose, about the controversy that just announcing it on social media generated, because I come more from the theatre background, where it would be irresponsible for the National Theatre, the Royal Court, the Kings in Edinburgh to not be tackling Brexit.
Yeah.
That's why we're publicly funded. There is a belief that storytelling has a place to gather people into a space, and through drama, through characterisation, through showing cause and effect, decisions and consequences, you generate an empathy and a nuance in an audience that Twitter, social media, reading the newspaper can't do.
Okay, let's just have a look at a little clip from the Brexit movie. So that's Cummings and Craig Oliver, who was David Cameron's press secretary.
Yes, which you would know that job quite well, I would imagine.
I would. And so how did you put that together? So that conversation never took place?
No, I'm afraid not.
Would they have had any relationship at all?
Yes, so they knew each other. So again, these are the choices I guess you have to make when you are taking real life events, but you have to make it work as a drama so that a mainstream audience, your mum in Mansfield and your mates at home can access it in order to make the difficult information sort of more palatable. So I'm a big believer in taking certain liberties as long as it's based on the essence of truth. So the essence of truth there is that they did know each other. They would see each other on the campaign trail and begrudgingly nod to each other. And then they've had conversations afterwards about their experiences. But I think for me, the real challenge when you're writing something as detail heavy as a drama about a referendum campaign, and how do you use data, how do you message, how do you reach your target audiences, who's on the board, that's all quite dry stuff, so it's looking for those human moments. And unapologetically to try and humanise people who we find difficult to empathise with, including Dominic Cummings, who even though I personally disagree with both his leaving the European Union and the method in which they fought that campaign, He's a human being. I believe that he believed it was right for the country. I believe that he thought it would be better. And also he went through a great amount of human stress during that time. His wife was giving birth. That didn't go very well. He would be in hospital often very late at night looking after her and then getting up at 6 a.m. It's not about generating sympathy, but it is about reminding ourselves that we are all human.
But and within the context, though, you're putting together a conversation. Is some of that based on things that they have said to you about each other or about themselves? I'm just interested in the sort of technique.
Yeah, so you assimilate and collect all of these different thoughts and things. Sometimes it's from interviews. So that thought that Craig Oliver expressed by Rory Kinnear was something he talked to me about. I think the train metaphor was his. Dominic Cummings has many 7,000 word blogs that if you were disposed to, you could look at. So it's their thoughts and feelings and their philosophies. And then that's just the great joy, and I genuinely enjoy it. I genuinely enjoy putting two people in a space and getting them talking. I mean,
and what was interesting as well is you mentioned the Queen, and I felt with the Queen, for example, that Tony Blair and the Queen were portrayed as real rounded characters.
Right.
And the rest of us were pretty much kind of a bit caricatured. And I felt within that, Dominic Cummings definitely is a rounded character.
Yeah.
Banks and Farage, for example, I felt were a little bit caricatured because you didn't have the time or the space or the depth to give them anything but that. Do you feel that is inevitable consequence of focusing on one person, or do you think you can get that depth going right through the whole thing?
I think you should. The artistic choice behind slightly heightening the other characters, whether it was Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, Nigel Farage, I think was a deliberate attempt to make comment, and you might disagree with this, that in that referendum, the public-facing people, the politicians and the spokespeople, obviously played a role. I think Boris Johnson's role was significant in the Leave vote, only in that he endorsed that particular side and normalised a view that actually wasn't particularly normal at the time. But actually, it's the people behind the scenes who made those decisions. It was Dominic Cummings who came up with 350 million. It was those policy advisors and strategists who came up with how they were going to target these messages and who they were going to reach. So I suppose I felt licensed, rightly or wrongly, whether it worked, whether it didn't, to deliberately infuse the people we'd never heard of with an intense reality, and the people we were familiar with to have more fun with, to show the extremes of public and private.
And it's interesting you said earlier that you felt that you were convinced that Dominic Cummings genuinely believed this was the right thing for the country.
Yes.
And yet the guy he was working for, Boris Johnson,
doesn't believe in anything.
Well, he wrote the two pieces.
He did, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And how do you know that? Do you know that Dominic Cummings actually wanted this to happen for the country rather than he was a hired hand trying to help a campaign?
I think that, but what do you think? Do you think it's something he
I don't know. I find it hard to believe that he does think in the terms that he set out in the film, or in as we've seen events unfold. But I don't know.
You see, when he was at the Department of Education, Cummings developed a loathing for the European Union and its structures and bureaucracy, and he thought it rendered cabinet collective responsibility, cabinet government, a myth. He thought it was, and it frustrated him. So whether or not that was enough for him to make the choices he did, I don't know. But I do think, I have to believe as the writer that he feels like what he is doing is correct and right. I don't feel that with Boris Johnson. I don't think Boris Johnson has any vision or believes in anything other than his own power. And that's why it's important to examine the people behind the scenes, because in the vacuum that is left by a Prime Minister not wanting or feeling or thinking anything, it's the people advising him who are going to have the influence.
So you're more sympathetic to Dominic Cummings than to Boris Johnson in terms of their approach to current events?
I mean, it's much fun. I am sympathetic only in the sense that I think Cummings and even Michael Gove has the integrity to believe what they set out to do, even if I disagree with them.
Gove's interesting because, of course, it's very hard when we know the characters. Dominic Cummings is less well known, so Benedict Cumberbatch can look whatever it looks. Michael Gove, Boris Johnson, Farage, etc. How hard is it to sort of settle the difference between wanting somebody who knows how to act and somebody who actually can vaguely look like that person? Because Michael Gove didn't look like Michael Gove, did he?
No, and actually Boris Johnson didn't look like Boris Johnson in that Boris is quite a big, imposing physical character. I'm not bothered in impressions. It's not spitting image. I really think it's about finding the best actors to find just a quality, a small little flavour that indicates towards it, but that you have to find a different kind of truth.
Because I always felt with Damned United that Johnny Giles as a 6'2" midfielder for Leeds United when he was one of the smallest players ever, just kind of spoiled the film for me. But am I being a bit nerdy?
I can't speak to that. But.
No, I know, you're not a full fan. Well, let's just on that then. Let's just have a look at another clip, because the other, I sort of feel you've done large parts of my life with both Ink, my tabloid world, and then you've got this kind of, you've followed the Labour Party's history very, very, very closely. But the next clip is from the film you did about the formation of the coalition. I was in the room then.
Yeah, sorry to write you out of that scene.
I don't mind. I really don't mind.
I didn't know 5 years later this was going to happen. Otherwise, I would.
No, but what's really interesting about that is that you had 3 women in the room, and I think I'm right in saying I don't think there were any women in the room. Now, I'm not saying that's a right or a wrong, but
no.
Does that sort of detail, will that keep you awake tonight?
Not at all, I'm afraid. No. Writing and dramatising British history is often an exercise in putting women in the room when they weren't there, but should have been there. So in that room, we had, I think, we had Sarah, we had Harriet Harman, played by Deborah Finlay. I think Sue Nye was in the room. Yeah, it's a problem. It's just a problem. It's depressingly difficult to find those roles if you're putting politics on stage. So I think you have to find this opportunity.
Yeah. No, because I know that Harriet was around the corner, Sarah was upstairs with the kids, and right. Sue Nye, I think she was listening to the call, but outside the room.
Right.
And from memory, I think it was Peter, Ed Balls, and Douglas Alexander and I.
Okay.
And the other thing was he did say you're a good man.
Yes, I forget who I got that from, but I think those last words were pretty accurate.
But there was a but.
Right. Oh, I didn't know the but. Yeah.
I think he said, I think there was a but and an and. He said that you're a good man, but I think this is the wrong thing to do. Okay. And at another point, I think he said you're a good man, and I think history may be kind to you.
That's going well. Yes, I think he said good man 3 times actually, didn't he? Yeah. But for some reason he kept repeating it.
And he also talked a lot about the Queen.
Right.
He kept saying this is becoming embarrassing. We're keeping the Queen waiting, which seemed a very odd thing to sort of. Whether he was just fed up with the whole thing, I think he probably was.
But I suppose when as a writer of real life events, you are often looking for those moments that you sometimes think you might have to manufacture because obviously history is not always a series of events where human beings, because of their own character and their own choices, can individually impact events in the way that they do in Shakespeare plays. But I do feel like that is one moment when the characters of the people in the room did change history. Nick Clegg couldn't really get on with Gordon Brown, right. Went with a man who was more like him in all possible ways, socially, educationally. But did you feel in that room at that time that it was still possible for an alternative branch of history to break off and that the Lib Dems and Labour to fall? Never. No. At what point did you realise it couldn't happen?
I thought that when the results came in,
there was no hope.
I did sort of think that deep down, yeah. I think the next 5 days were a legitimate, but ultimately flawed and fruitless attempt to try and stave that off. I think in the end, it is, the numbers dictated it.
Yeah.
And I do think that Nick's relationship with Gordon, prior to that, became a big factor.
Yes.
I think you're right. I think Nick Clegg just felt temperamentally, Gordon's never done anything for me. He's not going to. This is about hanging on. So I think you got Gordon's side of things right there. I suspect Clegg was kind of just trying to buy a bit more time to chisel a bit more from Cameron.
I think that's true. And so Mark Gatiss, who has played Peter Mandelson for me twice actually. He played the voice. There's a scene with Rory Kinnear in a kitchen where he got lots of Labour guys on the phone, including David Cameron. And Mark played Peter on that voice, which we never really announced. But Mark wants there to be a TV series about Peter Mandelson, right. Because I think he's so good at just capturing his intelligence, but his mischievousness and his twinkle and anything like that.
So you're going to do that or not?
I don't know if there's any appetite for a Peter Mandelson.
Can we have a show of hands if there isn't, and somebody can tweet that, and Peter can see that?
It's also true. While I've got it, because I really love and get really excited about the stupid, small, bizarre things in political life, and how big world events can often revolve around oddly human, strange things.
Yeah.
And I was so captivated by the idea that everyone became obsessed that Gordon Brown didn't want to leave in the dark, that he didn't want to have that Thatcher moment where it was really grim and really dark. And I read, but I could have just made it up, that it even got to the point when people were Googling when the sunset was happening. So that, and how long the Google Maps, how long it takes to get to the palace, how long it takes to come back, and just because they were so obsessed with the sunset that paved.
I don't remember that.
Okay.
I think you made that up.
It's good though, isn't it?
No, and this thing about the only time that I ever got pissed off with it was do you remember the film about David Blunkett and his private life called The Social Secretary?
Yeah.
And I was in that as the character who kept going to say to Tony, we've given him long enough, let's pull the plug, let's get him out. And I was the sort of, caricature hard man. And I was getting letters from people in Sheffield who loved David Blunkett saying, why were you so horrible to David Blunkett? And I was able to write back, I actually wasn't even there anymore. But one of you people had decided it didn't matter.
I would never do that.
No,
I would never put you somewhere. I didn't even put you somewhere where you were. I wouldn't put you somewhere you were.
What you've done in both the clips we've shown, though, and you mentioned this house, which of all your stuff, I've got to say, is my favourite. I think this house is brilliant.
Thank you.
But what you're obviously interested in is not just politicians as human beings. Well, maybe this is the same thing, but you're interested in what drives them emotionally. Yeah. And that can be complicated. It's not as simple as saying they want power. It's not as simple as saying they have strong beliefs. It's not as simple as saying they love their family. It's complicated.
It is, and also, well, the joy of this house for me was that it was set in the 1970s. We staged it in the National Theatre during the last coalition government, but it was the last hung parliament. And it was a time I wasn't even, I confess, born for. But I wanted to look at that building and the unique, bizarre, strange systems and rituals and processes that govern a very, very old system like that. And it would work absolutely fine if it wasn't for people, because people are really flawed and actually physically flawed. I'm sort of romantic about it, but of course in the Westminster system, if you want to vote, you have to vote with your literal body. You have to move it past someone and they count it. And I guess the idea is that it means if you're going to betray your party, if you're going to vote for something controversial, you see them, you have to look in their eyes and you have to walk a long walk before you make that decision. So I'm sort of for it. But it means in a minority government, when you've got sick and ill people in hospital, you get the farcical chaos, the extreme chaos of having to bring dying and sick people in an ambulance to a car park where they get counted through that way. And there was one moment that Walter Harrison talked to me about. Walter Harrison was the Labour whip who died almost the day after we opened the play. And he's a legendary figure in Westminster. I think Tony Blair said it was the only person he was actually frightened of.
That's a lie, by the way.
Fine. This is going well.
No, carry on.
What was I saying? Oh,
Walter Harrison.
Walter Harrison told me that there was, so you get these absurd extreme moments where if that is the system, there are moments when he would be with a Conservative whip, and the idea is you have to go to the sick person, and as long as they can be lying down on the floor, but as long as they're through the gate of New Palace Yard, you can count as long as the two whips are there to see him. And so there were conversations in ambulances about how alive or not certain people were based on how strong the heartbeat was.
Added to which, you're not allowed to die in the Palace of Westminster.
No, not in the Palace of Westminster, because then the royal coroner needs to...
I know, they have, even if you drop dead on live television, they will say that you were dead on arrival at St Thomas's Hospital.
Absolutely. And as tragic as that is, I love that stuff, because it's just... As someone who wants to understand democratic systems and processes around the world, it's a real gift, and I feel really lucky to be British, because it's so batshit crazy and we are so old. It's like everything is an origin story. So even the Brexit movie felt like an origin story. It felt like ground zero for what then happened with Trump and everything, all the populist surge around Europe. So whenever you're setting a drama in British politics, it feels like what you're doing is looking at the birth of something else.
But you could also, with the Brexit now, it could in the end boil down to a handful of MPs who may or may not be there at a given time on a given day.
Yes. No,
and that is how our future gets sorted. So it is a bit batshit crazy.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Let's just go to the kind of historical stuff in the Labour Party now. Because that's kind of where you made your name, really, isn't it? Is with these plays about. I mean, you were a struggling kind of playwright at the start, and you came up to Edinburgh and did your stuff, Coal Not Dole, and then you had a play about Maggie.
Yeah, I did.
You had a play about gay Tories.
It did. They do exist.
Yeah. And then but your big breakthrough really was thanks to the People's Party, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, I've just been fascinated by your party for a long time, and
I'm no longer in it, by the way. But
I know. But you might come back, mightn't you?
I'd like to.
If they invite you back. But I don't underestimate how, even though that joke, I remember my local MP, Gloria De Piero in Ashfield, and Ashfield and Mansfield is a very strange, and again, I'm very grateful to come from there. It's not ideologically consistent. It's not always left. It's not always right. During the miners' strike, it famously, the Nottinghamshire miners south went back to work. The Yorkshire miners just above us stayed out, and it was the scene of loads of clashes. So I think it's informed my nervousness about absolutism and dogmatic ideology over pragmatism, which I hope has given me a curiosity, or at least an empathy to tolerate.
Is that also where your kind of seeming fascination with Labour politics comes from? Because the miners' strike was such a big thing for the Labour Party.
I was only about 3 during the miners' strike, but the mines in my village started closing when I was about 10 or 11.
Yeah.
And it just meant instantly that the things that people were talking about on television, on the 9 o'clock news, I could see translate into the geographical change of my town. The pitheads came down, and the dole queue got longer, and people at school, their dads were made unemployed. So it felt very human and very real. Politics to me never felt like an academic thing.
Yeah, and the clip we're going to see is from Labour of Love. But which of the media do you prefer, theatre or television?
Television, of course. It's
and if we were at a theatrical convention.
I like them both for different reasons, Alastair. Television was the medium that made me fall in love with drama and storytelling. I didn't have theatre much in my life at all growing up, apart from panto and school plays. It was watching, even from a too early age, I would sit with my mum after she would come home from work and watch the 9 o'clock drama, whenever that was. And it was an age of those great Granada northern dramas that felt like I recognised people that talked and sounded like my family, like Cracker and Prime Suspect and Band of Gold. And I just adored it and got impossibly excited about storytelling. Theatre is a different, wonderful, glorious thing that I would never be able to give up, because the process is so different. You make something as an ensemble together in a room over 4, 5, 6 weeks, and you share it live, obviously. And so you have that exchange with an audience, which makes it feel organic and real. And then you listen to how the audience responds. You go back home that night, you bring in new pages the next day, you put something new on stage that night. I would never be able to give that up. But you have to be realistic about the political problems of theatre, and about how you get a mainstream audience interested, able to afford it, and believe that it has any value, given that it is disappearing from our schools, which is another entirely furious thing. It's a national scandal that the country that hosts the Edinburgh Festival and of Shakespeare and J.K. Rowling, that we are letting the arts disappear so silently from our schools, but it is really disappearing, and it should be the thing that concerns us the most, because...
Round of applause, please.
Not at all. It's just... yes.
And Brexit's not going to help with that?
It's not going to help with that at all. And no. But actually, again, I believe there is one of the multitude of problems that led to Brexit and have come out of Brexit are many, but one of the social toxicity and the tribalism and the lack of empathy in how we talk to one another, and how it's become not just fashionable but necessary to box yourself in and not engage with people across the divide. I think drama is, I know I'm being really romantic, but I do believe that drama and art and storytelling is a way through that, and you could absolutely input into the national curriculum drama, not just as a way of getting confidence and reading the classics, but to use those lessons and that time as a way of engaging with difficult issues, difficult things, to walk in the footsteps of people you wouldn't normally get a chance to think yourself into people's minds who you disagree with. And we could start to crack this empathy crisis. It may take 10 years, but I think that could be a function of drama.
But it's interesting because you're portraying all these issues. And I thought Ink was interesting on this because, Murdoch, quite an easy person to portray as a bogeyman.
Yeah.
And yet you didn't really. Again, it was a human story about him and his relationship with Larry Lamb and the way that he was trying to change the newspaper industry. You stepped right out of what you might think was a conventional wisdom emotion.
Yeah.
What's your real view about Murdoch?
Oh, God. I don't... well, I don't align myself with his worldview, and I think a lot of what his papers have done have been very damaging. But with the exercise I went on with Inc. was to try and understand why those papers are popular to people who I grew up with, what he thinks he's doing that is right and correct. The problem, so the play Inc., we just closed on Broadway, was set in 1969, and it's when Murdoch arrived on the street as a young man and created the modern populist. It was a play about populism, really, the modern populist tabloid. So I was trying to ask, well, what was he trying to fix? And news at that point was quite reverent and quite staid and quite boring. And he wanted to entertain people in order to suck them in and get them to engage in a way that was cheeky, fun, mischievous, irreverent, provocative. And some of those things I don't disagree with. But it's the added consequences of that I think have poisoned a lot of our discourse.
Right. So you're trying to be fair and reasonable in a more toxic age, even about the people who have perhaps helped create the toxicity.
It was useful to, as an origin story again, to go back to when he was a younger man, with all the doubts and ambiguities and uncertainties that young men have, as he arrived as an outsider, even though with all the privilege he obviously had, he arrived as an outsider. People rejected him, and in a joker way, he decided to burn the whole thing down. But I ask myself the question, whether it's Dominic Cummings, whether it's Rupert Murdoch, I ask the question every single time, what is the most generous interpretation of their actions I can give, just as an exercise? And you just have to ask, what is it they want? What are they fighting against? What are the things they do to try and achieve what they want? And I do wrestle with it. Look, I mean, I find...
Could you do that with Trump, for example?
No, because yes, I would. I would force myself over a massive whiskey to go, what is the emotional life, the inner life of that fictional character in the White House? But with Murdoch, I'm more inclined to. And actually, look, I do really wrestle. So there was a moment when we did the play on Broadway a few weeks ago, and Murdoch came to see it, and and the New York Times caught him leaving the theatre, and the company had met him, and that was reported. And there was and I understand why, there was a strong response from the theatre community in America about, well, you can imagine the kind of social media tweets I received. It was along the lines of, if he's happy to turn up, then you've not done your fucking job. And he came out with a smile on his face. Why is he smiling? He shouldn't have even wanted to come. And you go, okay.
Is that the first time you've seen it?
Yeah. No, actually, sorry, he saw it in the West End, and that's the first time I met him.
Right.
And there's a story there which is too long to tell, I'm afraid. But he wanted to come back, and he brought his editors. And you go, look, of course, I suppose there is a theory I would understand why people would say I'm the wrong political playwright for this time, because what we need is really, really strong. This is a war we're fighting. There's clear right and there's clear wrong, and what we need is very strong, unambiguous pushback against that stuff. And I have some sympathy with that view. However, I was reasonably pleased and reasonably proud that I could write and create a play that I think did hold him to account and questioned the outcomes of that philosophy that he created in the 1960s, but that was still empathetic enough and nuanced enough to allow an audience that watches Fox News and that reads The Sun into the space and not feel persecuted, and that allowed him into the space to actually engage with the conversation. Otherwise, you're just preaching to people who already think what you need. So I'm pleased that he came and he didn't hate it. I wanted him to hate it a bit, but the fact is he came with his people, and for all the stuff that he liked, he also had to listen to characters, fictional characters, go, I think this is what's wrong. I think you're a negative force in the news. And he has to sit there and listen to that. And I think that on balance, that's the right thing to do.
Okay. Let's see the clip from, we went off track there, didn't we?
I'm sorry, yeah, Labour, the Labour Party.
Labour of Love. There you go. Did Jeremy go and see that at all, do you know?
Strangely, no. But a lot of your guys did.
Yeah.
Do you think that's an accurate description of the new Labour philosophy?
I think, well, certainly is how do you align activism with a public that just wants politics to get on and do what it's meant to do? Definitely. Yeah.
And do you think it's because that was set? I set that in my local constituency in Ashfield, and that was set during, I think that was 1991. Looking back at the opposition under Kinnock and Foote, but obviously, I think it speaks to now. I sometimes get confused about what I think about the last election result in 2017. Because those seats all swung to the Conservatives, even though there's this national swing to Labour. Seats like that, traditional Labour heartlands, swung to the Conservatives, and they're the seats you normally would have to win if you wanted to get into power. Do you think it's now possible for Corbyn's Labour Party to get in just on Battersea and university cities and towns, or do you need to get those seats back?
Well, Labour's never ever won without Scotland, for example, and Scotland is, it's a very, very different politics now. I think the election, I think the Labour Party's been in denial since the election by thinking that they did very, very, very well. Actually, when I was having my troubles with the party, one of Corbyn's people came to see me and he actually used the phrase, I think one of the reasons we won the last election. And I said, hold on a minute, you lost? But, if you set expectations, so no, I don't, you've got to win both. You've got to build that coalition to build both.
I agree.
And it's and I don't see how they're going to get back. And also a lot of this idea that Labour is kind of, these left-wing northern seats want this more left-wing Corbynista approach to politics. I'm not sure it's right. They want tough on crime. They want to know that you're going to be strong in defence. They want, it's not as simple as the caricatures. And that, to be fair to you, I think that's the other reason I like that play. You didn't portray anybody in that as a caricature. They were dealing with difficult arguments. Okay. Listen, I was meant to have a few minutes for questions. We've got 2 minutes for questions. So the first person who puts their hand up can ask a question, and that'll be it. Come on. That's me then. Oh yeah. Right, shout it out, and I'll repeat it. Just shout out.
You say about how you're sort of personalising these politicians are humanising them. Sorry. Do you think there's an argument that politicians shouldn't be humanised? It should be purely based on their policies?
Good thought. Yes, they should of course be judged on their policies and their actions. But I believe that their policies are a window into their moral life, and which can only be based on their personal experience, their lived experience of growing up, and whatever informed their moral compass. So I don't personally separate their political life with their inner emotional life. And I do think, obviously in this country we have a great tradition of satirising politicians, sometimes based on real people, like Malcolm Tucker say, which is fun and can be fun, I imagine, great fun. I just thought I had to get it in before the end, otherwise it's like the elephant in the room. But I also think it has to be counterbalanced. It's great that we satirise and that we mock, but there is a danger to that. There's a danger that we just treat politicians like idiots to laugh at, and then we absolve ourselves of responsibility and sit in the pub and go, oh, they're all the same, they're all self-serving, they're all venal, and that is also dangerous. And I think that's one of the reasons we have the unhealthy situation we currently find ourselves in.
And we have Johnson and Trump. Quick fire, BBC or Netflix?
Both. Happy families. No, but I absolutely support and endorse public service broadcasting, and we need it.
Okay. Second referendum or not?
Jesus Christ, Alastair. I think the place it comes from is correct. And to be honest, I'm just a bit of a coward, because I want the outcome to be that we don't leave the European Union. I'm really, really worried about how you win that argument with people like the constituencies you just saw, and the damage that will do, and what narrative you can spin to collectively get us all back together again.
So that's yes, you support people's vote. That's it. There's a rally in the Meadows at 4:30 tomorrow, by the way, for those who are still campaigning. Very last question. Your current project is sort of way off. Is it? Am I maybe
a quiz?
Yeah.
The game? No, not really. We just started shooting. It's Stephen Frears. It's based on the Coffee Major scandal from Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. But it's more about truth and realities, and how over the past 15 years the threat to objective reality and knowing with conviction and evidence what is true and what is not true I think is one of the biggest threats to democracy. So again, I quite like trying to tackle big, worthy, meaty stuff, but through slightly bizarre, unexpected ways.
So the big worthy issue is there such a thing as an objective truth?
Have we started to lose that through and the case? Well, actually, the case of the coffee major, I don't think is cut and dry. He may be completely innocent, and so it's a counterfactual.
Be nice about everything, don't you?
Well, there are no bad guys in the world, except probably Donald Trump, but there are no bad guys. The producers think that he behaved weirdly on that show and that he cheated his way to £1 million using someone coughing on the right answers. They say, no, we didn't. How can you prove that I didn't know those answers? And that's also correct. There are so many weird things about that story. For example, the guy who was meant to be coughing from the audience, they had never met him. They'd only had the wife had only had 1 8-minute conversation with him because they were obsessors of the show, and she heard he was coming on, so she called him, and they meant to have plotted this over 8 minutes, having never met. The major didn't know who was coughing. There were 192 coughs, and only 19 of those were on the right answer. The major had never met the person who was coughing throughout the night, so there was like 80 on the wrong answer, but only 19 on the right answer. From a guy who had a medically diagnosed uncontrollable cough. So why would you pick him for a coughing heist? And then, anyway, so we'll see. And many more things. So we're going to try and unpick that, and hopefully ask questions about objective reality and post-truth and stuff like that.
Yeah, but you're really into the whole coughing thing.
It's mental. Were
you counting?
Well, I have like a transcript of all the coughs throughout the hour, and also then the guy who was coughing, went on the show next, and he was terrible. He only got to £1,000, and yet he's meant to have known the £1 million question and coughed his way. Anyway, tune in Easter ITV. It's going to be fun.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, James Graham.
Thank you. Thank you very much.